Uh-oh, that came over my headset. All right, hopefully this works. I think I fixed it. All right, so back to where we were last week. We'll do somewhat of a quick review. 261, I think. Yep. So last week we started talking about translation philosophy, and we were using the Aramaic translations. And so we're talking about the Syriac translations and the Targums, the Aramaic Targums. And we talked a little bit about like idioms. We used idioms last week. Like, what would you do if, what would you consider if someone said you had a long nose? And we said, well, in our culture, generally, long nose is someone who we consider a liar. I've had other thoughts too. I think I've attempted to mention this each time, and I've forgotten each time. Is, for example, if we were going to translate very literally, as some like to claim we should, very formally, and I said something to the nature of, you know, that came out of left field. And you were going to translate that into a culture that knows nothing about baseball. And they are going to try to figure out, what does this person mean by having something come out of left field? And it would be completely obscure to them. They would have no idea what that means. Whereas we would understand it. We're like, well, it's from the perspective of the hitter. He's running the bases. He's rounding third. He's on his way into home, and someone from the outfield behind him in left field throws the ball. They can't see it coming. It goes over them. The catcher catches it. They're surprised and they're called out. So coming out of left field is just means they were surprised. So what would be better? To translate it, they were surprised, or they didn't see it coming. It came out of left field, something of that nature. And so that's a lot of what happens with formal and functional translations. And what people don't realize when it comes to formal and functional translations is that how much of our language that we use is idiomatic. We talk that way regularly. Now, some things just come over pretty straightforward. If I said the dog is brown, there's no idiom there. And you can translate that very formally into most other languages. But as you can have conversation and things of that nature, your idioms start to come out, and you don't even realize you're using them because they are so second nature to you. All right. But as soon as you try to translate into another language, you begin to realize that the other person does not know what you're talking about when you translate very formally. And in order to accomplish a proper translation, you're going to have to go on the functional side. I have a friend right now on Facebook. He's been following the lessons, and he has really been struggling with his conviction on formal translations. And I told him he ought not have a conviction about it. But his conviction stems primarily from a good place. His conviction is one of, it is the word of God, and I want to retain every word of God. And so I prefer the formal translation. However, he recently just started a teaching position where he's teaching Spanish. And as he's teaching Spanish, he's begun to realize that how much of our language is idiomatic, and that to translate in a very formal way would not, it doesn't help his students. It doesn't help the receptor of the language. And he's realized he can't maintain a strong formal equivalency position. And so he's also come to the conclusion that, hey, when we can, we should be formal. But in most cases, what's probably going to be the normal is we're going to translate from a functional standpoint. And so that's that purpose of that optimal, is that balance between the two. And so as you converse with people, think about it. As you think about your Bible and translation, think about the words that you're using, and think about how they would be received by somebody in a culture not associated with your own, right? If you had to translate it into a culture that does not have the same reference points that you do, how would you have to translate it? You don't have to think of a second language. I know a whole bunch of languages, none of them well. And so I can think about it just conceptually. I can think about, well, that only works in America because I'm an American. And or that only works in English speaking countries, or that only works in European countries that have a European history or something of that nature. And as you begin to realize how much of your language is idiomatic, you start to realize that you couldn't do formal translation on a regular basis. Okay, so there's that. I say all that because I grew up in a culture, the culture I grew up in the KJV only culture. It was made sinful to translate in a functional way. That's the degree that they put it at. So that was my understanding. If you did something like what the NIV does, you have blasphemed God. And they would put up all of these different example verses and so on and so forth. And that was my understanding. So if you feel like I'm attacking formal translations, I'm really not. What I'm attacking is the position that formal translations are the only way to properly translate the Bible, which I disagree with. I think that is a way to translate the Bible, but not the only way to translate the Bible. I hope that makes sense. So as we continue, we talked about long noses. We talked about how that idiom exists also in the Hebrew. We talked about that idiom doesn't mean the same thing in Hebrew as it does in English, that a long nose in Hebrew has to do with being slow to anger, right? Because we talked about noses being long, noses being associated with wrath. The longer your nose, the longer it took you to get to a place of wrath, okay? And it was associated with wrath. Why? In the same way, I think our cartoons depict it quite well, is when someone gets angry, steam comes out their nose. That's actually very much the picture that's in Hebrew, is that the wrath was coming out your nose in a form of anger, all right, vehement anger. And so the longer it was, the slower you were to get there. All right, so it was an expression. All right. Then we talked about Leviticus last week. And this is where we started last week. And with Leviticus, we went to the beginning, the first verse. We talked about how Leviticus's name is the name of the book comes from the Septuagint, but in the Hebrew, it's he summoned. And when you go to the verse, you won't see the phrase he summoned. And my first thought is this was one of the places where the Jewish speakers were opting not to use the Lord's name. Turns out that that's not the case, that in the Hebrew there, it is very literally he summoned. And so that's what we found here. We showed that every single translation does not follow a very literal or formal translation in this verse, that they put the divine name first instead of the pronoun first, and then the divine name second. And we also said English just doesn't handle that well. We always put the object of the pronoun first, the antecedent, and then we do the pronouns after. But in Hebrew here, it's split. And then we said, well, actually, there is an antecedent. If we did follow it very formally, and we put and he summoned or and he called, as it is in the Hebrew, there would be an antecedent, and that antecedent would be found in Exodus. And so you'd have to go back to Exodus. See, I think I put it up there. Yeah, it's hard for you guys to read. We did this last week, but anyway, you would find the antecedent contextually in the previous chapter, verse 34, the last chapter of Exodus, and that would be where the antecedent comes in. And so what I was attempting to show you last week is that this is possible. You can see that antecedent if you wanted to translate very formally. And what I wanted to show you last week was a gentleman who believed that every single English translation obscures what's going on in Leviticus 1:1. And I let him lay out his argument in his own YouTube short. He has a much longer, I shouldn't say much longer, but it is a longer video on YouTube as well, where he breaks this down similarly to how I did, but I didn't feel like repeating myself or having him just he gets to the point a lot quicker in the short. So he thinks every single translation, English translation, obscures what's going on in Leviticus 1:1. I'll let him break it down for you.
Every single English.
Let's see. I just got this working. All right. I think it's correct on my end. Is it good on your end, guys? Yeah, all right. Of course. I'm gonna just turn it up. And if I can't get it to work, then that's fine. I'll just tell you what he says. Oh, watch that. I'll blow your eardrums out if it does work. All right. There's my.
English translation I have seen obscures.
Are you guys hearing it,
crucial
or is it just me that's
aspect
hearing
of
it?
Leviticus 1:1. The opening words in Hebrew read, Vayikra el Moshe. He called to Moses. This clause is universally translated as the Lord called to Moses, where the Lord refers to the divine name. The issue is that God's name is actually not there. Kevin, are you suggesting that he is referring to someone other than God here? Why does it matter whether God's name is used or he? Because by using a verb and only implying the pronoun he, we are invited to look to a previous verse for the subject. In one of the final verses of Exodus, God's glory fills the tabernacle. Moses was there, but he could not enter into the tabernacle itself because God's glory was there. Reading Leviticus 1:1 immediately after this verse makes perfect sense.
Were you guys able to hear it? A little bit, okay. Because I thought to myself, I can hear it really well. It sounds like it's coming in over my headphones, but I could be wrong about that. Let me see. I'm just gonna try one more time, just because I want to get it right, because I got future videos I want to play for you guys, and I want to do this every time. One more time.
Every single English
was my
translation
setting.
I have seen obscures a crucial aspect of Leviticus 1:1. The opening words in Hebrew read, Vayikra el Moshe. He called to Moses. This clause is universally translated as the Lord called to Moses, where the Lord refers to the divine name. The issue is that God's name is actually not there. Kevin, are you suggesting that he is referring to someone other than God here? Why does it matter whether God's name is used or he? Because by using a verb and only implying the pronoun he, we are invited to look to a previous verse for the subject. In one of the final verses of Exodus, God's glory fills the tabernacle. Moses was there, but he could not enter into the tabernacle itself because God's glory was there. Reading Leviticus 1:1 immediately after this verse makes perfect sense.
All right. So I don't want to hit on him too hard. He could probably run me into
Every single English translation.
Boom. All right. He could probably run me into the ground as far as what he's a Hebrew teacher. He is he does this for a living. He's a Greek teacher as well. He's very, very knowledgeable in underlying text, far more than I am. However, what I find happens almost in every case, every time I hear somebody say, every single English translation does X, I almost always find it to be wrong. I have yet to ever, or obscures, all right? And it's almost always in a negative way. Every single English translation does X in a negative way that you could only achieve. You could only understand this if you could read the Hebrew or if you could read the Greek. I don't think I've come across a place yet, because of the situation we're in today, where we have multiple English translations, where that has ever been the case, where I was like, oh, if I didn't have, if I was in a position where I didn't have all of these translations, I might find that that would be the case more often than not, because one translation can only tell you so much, okay? But because we have a plethora of translations, I have yet to find a situation. And so one of two things is generally the case that I see have happening every time someone says, every single English translation gets this wrong, except my favorite one is usually what it is. Every single translation gets this wrong is one of two things is happening. Either A, they don't know the Greek and Hebrew, and they've pulled out an interpretation incorrectly. Or B, they don't know the English, and they've misunderstood what the translators were doing in the English. So it's one of the two things. They either don't know the source language or they don't know the receptor language. In this case, the guy knows the source language very well. And what he misses is the receptor language, English. He is so focused on the Greek and Hebrew because that's what he lives in every day. He has forgotten to dissect English translations in his own time, and which I point out here that there are multiple translations that point us back to Exodus by the way they translate. And we use the word then to demonstrate that. I also showed you how and can do it and how now can do it as well, but I didn't think they did it quite as well as then does. And I explained why. I think and does it very good as long as you don't overuse and like the KJV does. That was my objection to that. The only two translations that I felt actually obscured it to a small degree would have been the NIV and the ESV in this case, because they start the sentence off with the. All right. Now, if you think to yourself, oh, I need to switch my Bible because I need to understand all of these nuances, well, just wait. In a couple of weeks, I'll pick the Bible that you switch to, and I'll show you where that one fails in a certain spot. Remember, there is no perfect translation, and I recommend you use them all. Well, not all. I'll put some boundaries on that later. But I recommend that you use, I would be willing to bet most of the popular ones you'd be safe with, most of them. There might be one that I would reject. Okay, so that's that. So we dealt with that. We dealt with how those translations can flip. You could have a formal and functional translation flip, and all of a sudden your functional translation is a formal one in this verse, and your formal one is functional in this verse. And so we continued to talk about that. I am going to move on quickly now. So we got all of that to say that we have that scenario in the translation philosophy of Aramaic, okay, in the Aramaic translations. So we have everything from the Harklian, which is extremely formal to the degree that it's almost interlinear. And then we have the Jewish Targums, which are in the paraphrase says. So we have nearly the full spectrum of translation philosophy found in Aramaic translations. The Syriac Peshitta is an update to the Old Syriac, and this is the one that Christians primarily use. You're going to see the Syriac show up in footnotes. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The Syriac is generally the Peshitta. The Philoxenian translation was a very, very formal translation, and it received a later update by Thomas of Harklen. And so Thomas of Harklen did the Harklian translation, and he made it even more formal. He pushed it further down the formal scale. And this happens today. I told you, I think I mentioned last week, that the Young's literal translation took the KJV and pushed it down the formal scale. And that was his entire intention. His objection to the KJV, that it wasn't formal enough, even though it's still quite a formal translation. It wasn't formal enough, and so he pushed it down the formal spectrum. We have that happening today in the NASB. The NASB 95 was the only NASB out for a long time, and then in 2020, the translator said, hey, we actually want to move it closer to the optimal. So they went from formal closer to the optimal. And then the translators behind the LSB said, we don't like that. They took the NASB 95 and they pushed it down the formal scale. So the NASB translation split down. We'll talk about that when we get into the history of the NASB. But that's what happens. Translators have a conviction, sometimes a conviction, or a preference, I think is probably a better word, for formality or for functionality, and then their translation reflects that preference. All right, we talked about the Septuagint last week, I think, as well. Come on, where are you? There you are. The Septuagint last week, how it was on that same spectrum. I mentioned that this isn't my spectrum either. John Mead put the spectrum up in his book. I'm just reduplicating it in my own formatting. His formatting is actually reversed to mine. He puts functional on the left side and formal on the right. But I placed them all in the same spots that he does. And then to show you the paraphrastic nature of the Targums, we were in Genesis 6. We went through that. And then We talked about Thomas of Harkle, how he made his translation very literal, and the simple Syriac, the Syriac Peshitta. And I said every translation has its unique issues. All right, you got to take the source language and you got to put it into your receptor language. And doing so is always going to bring its unique issues. So I'll just give you a few off the top of my head. Greek and Hebrew are gendered language, right? The table is female in Hebrew, I think. Don't quote me on that. But the gender is female in Hebrew. But we don't say anything about its femininity in English. It has nothing to do with it. We don't think of our nouns that way. We do in a colloquial sense. Sometimes we call ships girls or cars girls or things of that nature, but we don't genderize any of our nouns. But Hebrew does. So when you translate from Hebrew into English, if I said she has 4 legs, referring to the table in Hebrew, we would never translate it that way. In English, it doesn't work. We don't talk that way. We would say it has 4 legs. Latin. We're going to talk about the Latin soon. Translation difficulty in Latin that you have to deal with is that Latin doesn't have a definite article. The doesn't exist in Latin. And so that can cause a lot of issues, and you have to figure out how to work with that. So we're talking about the Aramaic. What are some of the issues in Aramaic that they had to deal with? Well, the one I want to kind of bring up today is the fact that the New Testament and the Old Testament, but primarily we're going to talk about the New Testament here because we're going to be talking about the Peshitta and the Harklian translations, is that they have to deal with Aramaic in the New Testament. So why is this a problem? Let me show you. Let's go to Mark 15:34 in the CSB. This is very normal translation. All the translations render this pretty much the same way. But it says, and at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? Well, what we read, the unintelligible part to us, was Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is Aramaic. And so this works fine in English. Why does this work fine in English? Because Mark is dealing with a people who don't understand Aramaic. And so he wrote Aramaic down, and then he translated it into Greek. In our case, we write Aramaic down and translate it into English. Now you're an Aramaic translator, and you get to this verse, and that first line makes perfect sense to you. But the second line is a translation. What do you do? What do you do? You want to maintain the word of God. If you're going to stay very formal, you're going to have to translate that. It's kind of like asking someone to translate the word taco into Spanish. That's how John Meade puts it. I think that's a good way to do it. Or if, for me, my background is French. And so if I went to Canada and I was like, what is rendezvous in French? It's rendezvous. That's just a borrowed word. So this is the same situation where you're asking the Aramaic translator to translate Aramaic. It's already in Aramaic. Let's give you another one. Mark 5:41. And he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Ka'um, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. Well, what we read was Aramaic. And what Mark is doing is translating it into Greek. This is helpful to understand who Mark's audience is. Mark's audience is primarily Gentile, right? Not Jewish. Matthew's audience was primarily Jewish. He doesn't do a lot of this sort of thing, but Mark does. Mark does this throughout his gospel, where he's taking Aramaic words and he's translating them into Greek for his Greek-speaking audience. And so what do you do if you're a translator of Aramaic and you're someone like Harklian who wants to go extremely formal? I don't want to lose anything. I've got to keep every word that's put there. Well, my understanding, I can't read Syriac, so I'm going to relay to you how it was relayed to me. But my understanding is that what Harklian did is he rendered the first verse And at 3, or the first phrase, and at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Okay. And he translated and he maintained that. That stayed the same. And then it says, which is translated, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And what he does is he essentially transliterates the Greek back into Aramaic so that the translation is actually unintelligible to his Greek, to his Aramaic audiences. So they're reading Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and then they read something unintelligible. It's backwards. In that way, he maintains it, but he has done nothing for the reader. The reader is like, which is translated into gibberish, right? If we had flipped those two lines, and at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is translated, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. You're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Yes, it should. But he wanted to maintain everything. He does the same thing in the Talitha Ka'um, little girl, I say unto you, he does something similar there. Now, the Syriac Peshitta does something different. Syriac Peshitta is very concerned, it's simple Syriac, it's very concerned about the reader, the one who's reading it. So what does the Syriac Peshitta do in this circumstance? They don't give the second line. Just says, at 3, Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? With no mention of the translation after the fact. Same thing with the other one. And he took the child by the hand and he said unto her, little girl, I say to you, get up. Right? And so these are just translation difficulties that are going to show up in every language. Every language is going to have something that they have to deal with. In this case, Aramaic translators that had to deal with things of this nature. We deal with the same sort of thing. And I think it's Paul, he says, Maranatha, anathema, that's Aramaic. And some English translations maintain it. Most English translations actually just translate the words into English. Let's see. Normally, okay. Normally what I would do at this point is, what I've been doing at this point is every time I come across something of this nature where I've shown you, hey, this is a really valuable insight to help us with translation today, I almost always have been giving you an English version of it, right? So when I got to the Septuagint, I was like, here's an English version. So you can read the Septuagint. Hebrew Bible, here's an English Bible written in the Hebrew order. So you can see that. When I started looking for English translations of the Peshitta particularly, now this is interesting, is we do live, I am so happy we live in the day and age that we live in, where we have all of these options, where we have all of these tools that can help us today. We are not lacking for tools, okay? There's so much you can achieve today for free, by the way, that we couldn't do even 50 years ago, okay? Or 100 years ago, for that matter, never mind 400 years ago. We have so many tools at our hand. However, one of the tools we're lacking, from what I understand, is a good, reliable English translation of the Peshitta. We just don't have one. I found 2 English Peshittas on the market, and when I've asked about them, one particularly by the name of George Lamsa, and another one, I get, it's a love-hate relationship. You either love it or you hate it. And so because I don't consider that sort of consensus to be one where I would say, hey, it's reliable, go use it, I say use it with any caution you have. You can find one on BibleHub.com. There's an English translation of the Peshitta on there. But again, when I inquired about that one, was received with very mixed reviews. George Lamsa is said to have inserted his theological beliefs in to the degree that he affects translation. So we all want to draw our theological beliefs out of translation, not impose them on translation. And it seems like he did that. And there were places where people were saying he just outright mistranslated. And so that being said, I don't have a good way for you to interact with the full Peshitta in English. But fear not, there are ways to still interact with the Peshitta. And primarily with the Bible that you have in your laps, primarily, depending on which Bibles you have. So A lot of what I've been doing, where I show you multiple translations and I show you how each one handles it, a lot of this is done in single Bibles through the footnotes. And I've not talked about the footnotes at this point yet, but I think this is a good time to introduce footnotes into our lesson. So remember when we talked about Psalm 22:16, we talked about that the Hebrew translations, the English translations of the Hebrew Bible say like a lion, while the English translations of the Septuagint say they pierced, right? We went through that. Well, most of you, if you have particular Bibles in your hands, would have seen that in the footnote. So here, the CSB puts in the footnote, some Hebrew manuscripts, the LXX and the Syriac. See that Syriac right there? They're saying the Syriac also says they pierced here, okay? And then you can see other Hebrew manuscripts read like a lion. So a lot of that where I was just showing you how different translations handle it is actually handled right in the footnotes of many of our Bibles. And so your footnotes are really important. So if you want to interact with the Syriac Bible, pay attention to the footnotes because the translators will engage with the Syriac when it's helpful for you. Let me give you another one. This is from the ESV. The ESV says, come on, the ESV says Syriac, okay? This is from the NKJV, says Syriac. From the NIV, lets you know what the Syriac says, okay? From the LSB, oh, the LSB doesn't tell us. It just says, or like a lion. So this one's a little bit more difficult, all right? So this is another reason why you should use multiple translations, not just for their translation, but also for their footnotes. All right, let's look at another one. NASB 20, like a lion, another reading. At least they put another reading. So what happens with, oops, too far. Let's go back. What happens with the word or, and you need to reference your Bible's preface to understand exactly how they're using these words. But generally, or means this is another way to translate it. You can translate it this way, which is not what's actually happening here. This isn't another way to translate this. This is a different source text. So I don't care for the use of the word or there. Whereas the NASB 20 says another reading is like a lion. That lets you know there is another source text, but they don't tell you where it's coming from, right? So all the other previous ones I told you, they told you the reading we chose comes from here, but there is another reading that comes from the Masoretic text or the other Hebrew texts. So pay attention to those footnotes, okay? So we'll give you another one now. Here's an interesting one. In Isaiah 49:17, you'll see that we have your builders hurry. Let's see, I did this in the CSB. Your builders make haste in the ESV, and your sons shall make haste in the NKJV. So what you see here is you're going to see a difference in translation between builders, and sons. All right. And so you'll see that the CSB says, hey, we're following the Dead Sea Scrolls, Aquila, Theodotion, the Vulgate. However, the reading for sons can be found in the Masoretic text, the Syriac, Symmachus also reads sons, okay? Now, this is actually really cool because when we talked about translations from the LXX, if you remember, we talked about diplomatic translations and eclectic translations, and I showed you a list of Greek translations from the Septuagint, and they had different names, Theodotion, Symmachus, and so on. They are all listed in there. What the CSB translators are making you aware of is that there's a split in the reading for the LXX. Some Septuagint, Theodotion, and Aquila say builders, but Symmachus reads sons. Okay, that's within the LXX. Now we're talking about the Syriac here, but you'll see here the Dead Sea Scrolls, DSS, reads this way as well. The Vulgate, which we haven't gotten to, we'll talk about that one next, reads this way. But the Masoretic text, the Syriac and Symmachus read sons. The ESV says, hey, we followed the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't give us any of this extra detail here. We followed the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, the Masoretic text says, your children make haste. Okay, I'm really super nerdy. I want all the information I can get. I want to know where to start looking. and start drawing my own conclusions. So I really appreciate all of this extra nuance up here. The NKJV does quite a bit too. I appreciate this. The NKJV says, hey, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and the Targum and the Vulgate read builders, but they chose to opt for the Masoretic text as opposed to what the other translations did. So why? Why is this the case? So you're going to see that different translators have different philosophies in the same way that we did that with the LXX, with the Septuagint. Remember, I talked about diplomatic translations and eclectic translations in the Septuagint. I said in the eclectic translations, they're taking all of the evidence and then they're making their best decision that they can based on the evidence that they've been given. The diplomatic says, hey, we think there's one primary good source text. In the Septuagint's case, it was Vaticanus. And they said, we're going to translate Vaticanus. And then where Vaticanus is obscure or we're not sure, or we think there's an obvious error, then we'll supplement from another Greek text. Well, the NKJV is very much diplomatic, whereas the ESV and the CSB are eclectic, okay? They are taking all of the evidence and they're making their best decision based on all of the evidence. The NKJV says, hey, we think the Masoretic text is the best text for the Old Testament here. And so we're going to do a diplomatic translation. We're going to follow the Masoretic text wherever it leads, unless we think there's an obvious error or there's an obscurity and we need to use something else. And so generally speaking, they will follow the Masoretic text. We haven't talked about the Masoretic text. That's going to come after the Vulgate, but we'll talk about that then. But the Masoretic text is the primary source text for all of our Hebrew Bibles. All of them. The Bible in your hand is primarily sourced from the Masoretic text. But they're eclectic in that they will consult other Old Testament translations, Old Testament manuscripts to see what they think the best reading is, where the NKJV generally will not. They'll let you know in the footnote, but they won't necessarily put it in the text. All right, let's talk about Judges 14:15. This is an interesting one. So the previous one would be up for like kind of interpretation. Is it sons or builders? That doesn't really impact the text that much. This one impacts the text more. For some background, you've got Samson. He's about to get married. He goes into the wedding. A bunch of Philistines are there. And there's definitely some bad blood between the Philistines and Samson puts out a riddle. Answer me the riddle in 7 days, because the wedding is 7 days long. Answer me the riddle by the end of the week, and I'll give you a bunch of clothes worth a whole ton of money. But if you can't answer the riddle by the end of the week, you give me a whole bunch of clothes worth a whole ton of money. And to the degree that this could bankrupt somebody. That's how much this was going to be worth. And so if you read in verse 14, we'll read it just from the CSB here. It says, so he said to them, out of the eater, this is the riddle, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. After 3 days, they were unable to explain the riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife. So you see, on 3 days, they're like, we can't figure it out. They're halfway through the week, we can't figure it out. We'll go to Samson's wife. The NKJV says, now for 3 days, they could not explain the riddle, but it came to pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife. So if you read the NKJV, they waited to the last minute. They tried for 3 days and then quit, apparently. I don't know what they did for the next 4 days. And then on the 7th day, they went to Samson's wife and said, help us get the riddle. Or, according to the CSB, on the 4th day, they went to Samson's wife. All right. And so what you have here in the NKJV is they are following the Masoretic text, the Targum, and the Vulgate. Masoretic text has 7th here because they're a diplomatic translation of the Masoretic text. They're going to go with the 7th reading. Where the ESV, I think the ESV, I'm almost certain most of the other translations follow the Latin, the Septuagint and the Syriac. The Syriac and the Septuagint say it happened on the 4th day. Now, most translations go with the 4th day because that's the natural reading. After 3 days, they couldn't figure it out. So on the 4th day, the next event is that they went and asked. All right, and we have these 2 readings and we have to decide which one's right. Then the question becomes, well, how does the word 7th end up in there? If 4th is correct, How did we end up with the word seventh? Well, if you read through this, this chapter here, 7 comes up multiple times. 7 days of the wedding, on the 7th day, I think it comes up 4 times, all right, including here. And the difference between 7th and 4th is 1 letter. It's a 1-letter difference between 7th and 4th. Now, this is not a case of a tittle situation where a stroke makes the difference. That's not what we're dealing with here. They are very different letters. It would be the difference between, for example, something like our W versus our R, right? The letters are so distinct you couldn't confuse them. But it's 1 letter. It's a 1-letter difference. And so the theory is that as the scribe was writing, he saw the word, or at least most of the word, assumed it's just another rendering of 7th, and that's what went in the text. Okay? We think it's a scribal error. That's the other side. The other side is there is no scribal error. They did actually just wait till the 7th day. They waited to the last minute. Some things have to occur there. That's fine. You can go either way, but both let you know that the Syriac, that's what we're paying attention here, says something different. Okay? And so, yeah, that's about it. So I wanted to make this point known to you is that you should have Bibles that have the translator's footnotes in them. They do produce, almost every publisher, except for one that I'm aware of, every publisher produces versions of their Bible without the translator's footnotes. They produce editions without the translator's footnotes. And I object to that practice. I don't think a Bible translation is complete unless you have the translator's footnotes. This is not just my opinion. I'll demonstrate it from multiple translators, but the Erasmus believe that, the KJV translators believe that, the ESV translators believe that, the CSB translators believe that. They want to give you information, and when publishers remove that information, you've removed part of your Bible, okay? It is possible that one of those guys got it wrong, but it's still, your Bible is still there in the footnotes, okay? And so you definitely need to engage with your footnotes. You want to engage with your footnotes, in this case, primarily, if you want to know what early Christians read in the Aramaic, the Syriac. Those Syriac footnotes are there for your benefit. So that's that. That's the end of the Syriac Aramaic translations. You can see that the NKJV also, in this case, also introduces the Targum. Okay, the Targum follows the Masoretic text there. So we talked about Aramaic Targums. Now, that being all said and done, that's it for the Syriac and Aramaic translations. We are going to pick up next week with the Latin Vulgate. And this will be, in my opinion, historically, if the Septuagint was the most influential translation on our Bibles today for the Old Testament, the Latin Vulgate is going to be the most influential complete Bible on our Bibles today. Okay, this will be the most influential one. We're still influenced by this one heavily, and we'll talk more about that next week.